Hello, and welcome to the Raising Risk-Free Teens podcast. I'm your host, Cheryl LaBelle. In this risky world we live in today, we want to equip parents to help their teens avoid unnecessary risk. We'll touch on hot topics of the current culture. We'll talk about sexual risk avoidance and any other important information to keep you informed as a parent. All of our topics are rooted in science, facts, and medical accuracy, not opinion. Thanks for listening and hope you enjoy the podcast. This is part 2 of our special series on sex trafficking, and today we're shifting from awareness to action. In part 1, we explored what sex trafficking is, how it affects victims, and how it operates both internationally and here at home. If you missed that episode, we encourage you to go back and listen. Today, we are asking a critical question. Would you know the signs if a teen, even your own, was being groomed or trafficked? In this episode, we'll walk through the red flags to watch for, what makes teens especially vulnerable, and how traffickers manipulate and control their victims. And just as important, we'll talk about what to do if you suspect something is wrong, from starting a conversation to reporting and connecting with support services. You'll leave this episode better prepared to protect the young people in your life. Returning for this conversation is Rylee Richardson. Thanks so much for being here today.
I'm happy to be here.
Great. Let's recap a little bit from our last episode. How would you define sex trafficking?
Sex trafficking is when a trafficker uses fraud, force, or coercion to compel another person or child to engage in commercial sex acts.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about these vulnerabilities. We touched on this in our last episode, but what are some of those vulnerabilities that victims have?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, as we talked in the last part, unresolved trauma, unmet emotional needs, homelessness, or household dysfunction where maybe a teen doesn't feel safe at home, or there's just a lot of relationship dynamics that they're unsure of how to deal with. Addiction, either on the part of the teen or maybe even a family member or friend, a history of abuse, and even just adverse childhood experiences. So if a child has grown up in a rather rough environment, and experienced some either sexual abuse or witnessing things that no child should have to witness, those things create vulnerabilities in even adults, even if that happens as a child. So
how is someone with these vulnerabilities, how are they lured into being recruited?
Traffickers seek for vulnerabilities so that they can exploit them. They use these weaknesses in other people for their gain, and it's quite heartbreaking. But that is primarily how traffickers lure in their I guess you could say targets, but their victims. So,
in the last episode, you had mentioned that someone who's being trafficked usually knows their trafficker before. How do they make those connections or build that relationship?
Yeah. Traffickers make their victims dependent on them, or at least make the victims think they need to be dependent on them. So that can look like a trafficker providing an emotional attachment to someone who has unmet emotional needs, or someone who's lonely, someone who's seeking even a romantic relationship. One of the most widely used methods of a trafficker to lure girls that are sex trafficking victims is the lover boy method. So this boy will come into their life and try to swoon them and romance them. They might buy them gifts. They might just try to encourage them almost and make them feel loved and appreciated and seen, and like no one else can see them the way that their trafficker sees them. And in that moment, obviously the girl thinks, oh, I just found a boyfriend, or this is the love of my life, and they don't know any better because they have such a deep wound where they need that love to be filled. And so that's definitely a way that traffickers try to get their victims. And even just friendship. It's not always romantic. It can be just friendship of someone looking out for them, and maybe they're providing food and housing, and then suddenly it turns and then they owe that person who's been providing for them. And so that's a need that they need met, because everyone needs food, everyone needs shelter. And so that victim doesn't know where else to get it, and now they feel like they owe them. So then maybe they have to go do XYZ.
So from what you've learned about sex trafficking and your experience with victims, do these relationships happen in person or online?
They, especially in the U.S., they primarily start off online, either through online dating profiles or social media, so Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat, any of those is a possibility. It usually at least starts off online and then unfolds into something that can be an in-person relationship where either they meet up or something of that nature. They're mailing each other letters or something like that. So
Yeah. What are the most common signs that a teen might be involved in or targeted for sex trafficking?
So since it is teenagers that we're talking about, some of them can be just regular teenage behaviors, right? So some of the signs could be irritability or mood swings, or maybe they're on their phone texting a lot because they could be building that relationship with that trafficker that's grooming them. It could even be maybe specifically for a younger child, them maybe knowing more about sex than they should. It could be unexplained absences. So those are more of on the behavioral side. But some more indicators could be a detachment from friends and family, except for their trafficker, because the trafficker's trying to separate them from their loved ones, right? The victim maybe won't have their ID on them or their birth certificate, that the trafficker will. The victim could be being controlled, not looking up, seeming nervous in public. They lack a freedom of movement, and they're not receiving a payment for their work if it's a job, or what other people are perceiving as a job.
That's interesting to hear all of that when I do think about my own teenagers and being on their phone a lot or being irritable, those kinds of things, which brings awareness to how much, as a parent, I want to get to know who my kids are talking to and what they're talking about. And I don't mind that they're on their phones or that they have their own lives. But I suppose if I ask the question and my child wants to be secretive about it or is isolating even more than normal, that should be a concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more that I forgot to mention that I think we might talk about a little bit later is sexting. If a teenager is sexting and maybe you, the parent, finds that later on, that could be a red flag as well.
Because that's going to be some grooming, right?
Absolutely. And even potentially a way that the trafficker could use, like almost as an advertisement later on.
That's scary. Yeah.
So I do have a little bit of a personal story. It wasn't me, but it was someone that I knew growing up. So I would have been in middle school age about, and one of my peers had started talking to a much older guy online. I think they met through Instagram, and he was meeting her unmet emotional needs, and he was telling her how beautiful she was. And I believe she was going through a divorce, or her parents were going through a divorce, so she was experiencing all of those emotions that come with that. And he was really supporting her, and trying to just be there for her was what it looked like on the outside. But I specifically remember her parents had found out about it because this guy had mailed her a gift, and it was like new shoes or something like that. And so they obviously couldn't ignore that.
Yeah.
Like that was a new thing that their child was wearing that they hadn't bought her. And so, yeah, just stories like that are scary because it is close to home.
Yeah.
And like that was someone that I knew personally growing up, and nothing ended up happening. Her parents were able to step in because they recognized, hey, this is suspicious. They recognized that sign. So I'm really thankful for that, because if not, she might have met up with him one night and then it could have gone anywhere from there. So yeah, it's really important to know some of those signs.
As you share that story, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a mom a few years ago. Her daughter is the same age as my son, my youngest son, and so we were talking, and her daughter's cell phone, it had been taken away. I think that's why we started the conversation, but I think it was through Roblox that an older man reached out to her, and it was behavioral changes. She was isolating more from her family. Instead of coming to dinner, she was staying in her room. I think her language was changing a little bit in reflecting an attitude change towards her mom. And so there were some behavior patterns there that sparked mom's interest. So then I think she took her daughter's phone to look at it and then saw the conversations, and she was, in fact, being groomed. And now whether that was for sex trafficking or if it was going to be some kind of a sexual encounter with an older gentleman, but with everything that you're sharing, it really sounds more like it could have been a lot worse for this young lady. Because mom got involved, put an end to that. And you wouldn't even think Roblox, that's supposed to be a safer platform, but it's really
any online platform where you can talk to strangers. I mean, it's
not good.
It can happen anywhere. I know that specifically in young boys, it's not uncommon for trafficking and grooming to occur over video games.
Well, that's how they connect a lot of the time.
Just like that with Roblox. So,
in our last episode, one of the misconceptions that you mentioned is that it's only females who are sex trafficked, but really it's males too. And as a parent, that we think online gaming and talking to others that's totally normal and how they connect and have their social life. But we probably should pay a little bit more attention to who they're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
If I suspect trafficking is happening, what is the very first step that I should take?
Well, the worst thing you can do is nothing.
Okay.
The worst thing you can do is ignore it. It's always worth, especially if it's your teen, it's always worth the conversation. It's always worth asking, hey, why are you acting this way? Or hey, what's going on? Or even just offering the open table of saying, hey, I love you. Let's just talk. And being that open support and having that open communication is a game changer, especially if it is your teen.
That's interesting that you say that. I'm recalling a webinar that I watched, and there was a young lady. She was talking a lot about social media. She's in the business of how to protect your kids, and she was being groomed. She was going to leave the house. She had it all planned, packed up. She was ready to leave, and she told her mom, actually. She said, I'm leaving.
Wow.
And because her mom, she responded favorably. She didn't say, no, you can't leave, any of that. She looked at her daughter, and I believe she told her that she loved her, and if that's what she felt she needed to do it. And because her mom didn't respond negatively, but and I don't think that mom was actually supportive of her making this decision, but did say that I love you and care about you. It's like that's what she needed to hear to stop her in her tracks.
Yeah,
and it did stop her, but she still had a lot of other experiences through her online interactions, but that spurred on a passion to try to help parents protect their kids. So it's interesting, all of these stories that are out there, and they all look completely different. So the worst thing to do is nothing or to ignore it. All right, so then what's next?
Yes, so don't do nothing and definitely do something.
Do something, okay.
And if it is your child, I would recommend opening up the conversation and really just emphasizing your love for them and that you care for them, because it's very likely that they want to reach out and that they want help, but they don't really know how to go about that. And especially if there is some trauma involved, they have a lot of mixed feelings about it. And they may need your help to kind of put the puzzle pieces together and figure out what comes next. But there is also always the hotlines. And if you feel, and I mean, use your best judgment if whatever scenario you're going through, call 911 if it is an active emergency, of course. But hotlines are probably the best way to go, because they can walk you through, okay, what are you seeing? What are the signs? And they can help walk you through next steps. One thing that I will note is that at least in Indiana, we are all mandated reporters. So if you suspect anything with a minor, you're mandated to report it. So you really should not be taking a step back. You really should be taking a step forward and being proactive. And even if it's nothing, good. I'm glad it's nothing, but please, if you suspect anything, even if you don't think it's anything, it's worth a phone call.
Yeah, and the good thing about those hotlines, if we see something and suspect something, we don't have to prove it. We report it, and then they have people and procedures in place to investigate it.
Yeah.
And we can also remain anonymous
Yes.
through that process. So it truly is going to help the individual who's involved. So, yeah.
And even if it may not be a sex trafficking case, there may still be other forms of abuse happening. And so either way, you're shedding light on something that might not be a great situation. So,
Yeah, no, that's great advice. How do I approach the teen if I'm concerned about them?
So again, if it's your own child, I would say have a conversation with them. However, especially if it's someone that you don't know, and you don't really have a relationship with them, and maybe you're out in public, say you're at a mall, and there's a much older gentleman with a young girl, and he's treating her kind of weirdly. It's not a normal behavior, and you feel like she's a little bit nervous and scared, but she's not really looking up. I would say that might not be the time to physically go and intervene. You might need to just report it and see what's happening. If there is security around, then you could go notify security. But it's not always, it can endanger the victim if you go and try to intervene. So I think the best course of action would be to find local security, maybe call 911 in that instance, but definitely call the hotline, report it, and just go from there. So.
You mentioned that we should do something and not ignore it. And if we see it publicly, we could put the victim in danger. So that would be another action not to do. Are there other things that we should avoid, other behaviors or things we should avoid?
None that I can think of. You really don't want to endanger an already not good situation, especially if there is physical abuse involved, which oftentimes there is at least a little bit. So I would just be careful and use your best judgment, because if you feel like it would be an okay situation to maybe step in and pretend to be a relative or something, but again, you never really know. There's a lot of variables that could go into that.
Sure.
So I would be very cautionary to physically intervene in a situation like that. I would get authorities and report it and do your duty in that way.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. We've talked about the vulnerabilities of the people who get trafficked, and then going through that trafficking situation. In episode 1, you shared a little bit about what that looks like. Let's just touch on that again, that what they could potentially experience in that trafficking situation, and then the kind of support and help they're going to need coming out on the other side.
Yeah. There's so many facets that go into this. Obviously, they're experiencing a lot of emotional turmoil even before they're getting into this scenario, because oftentimes that's one of the reasons, as we talked about, the vulnerabilities, to have unmet emotional needs, especially when it comes to sex trafficking and the lover boy method that traffickers use. And so they've already had that, and now they have all of this trauma from being sex trafficked, which means that a woman could be servicing a man up to 30 times a day.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of physical, emotional repercussions to that sort of activity. They could be struggling with STIs, which is another reason why, with all of the medical issues that they could have, medical staff of any kind should be aware of the signs as well. They could be going into the emergency room. They could be going into just little clinics. So we need to be aware of that in those spaces as well, because they could be seeking some medical help, but oftentimes they don't. And so then that could even become what could have been a small injury can become a lifelong thing that they have to deal with if it's not taken care of immediately. So, and just the emotional aspect of it, especially coming out of it, they really need professional care that's trauma informed, as you said last time, and that understands how to deal with all the things that they've experienced, because they've gone through so much physically and mentally with all of the manipulation, the mental and physical abuse that they've endured.
Yeah, it is such a serious topic that it needs the attention for education. I'll just share a story was shared with me that did hit closer to home. A friend of mine, her daughter, she's in college, and she had a roommate who was a cheerleader, made good grades. I don't know a whole lot of information, right, to guess what her vulnerabilities might have been. But when you're on a college campus, you're invited to be a part of different groups and activities. And so she had gone and she developed a relationship with this man who he was a local mentor and had some sons of varying ages it didn't really make sense that all of these young men would be his adopted sons. But anyway, she developed a relationship with him, and it wasn't a romantic sexual relationship either, because it was more of a mentoring role. And I believe there were some others too who were building that kind of a relationship with him. But the roommates, what they saw, her behaviors changed. She started dressing differently. One of the sons was several years younger than her, and here she is a college-age student, several years younger than her, and he was coming in and he was giving her direction and instruction on how she should dress or what she should or shouldn't wear, and they thought that was kind of odd. She ended up quitting the cheerleading team, and she would disappear for a little bit. And then eventually she completely disappeared. And they were asking her questions, why did you quit cheer? And why did you quit going to school and your classes? So they were very concerned. They reached out to her mom to say, hey, can you help? Can you intervene? And mom said, well, she does this sometimes where she just kind of disappears and does her own thing. She'll be fine. And they were reaching out. They weren't satisfied with that, right? That was concerning for them because they didn't know how to convince mom, no, she really is changing her behavior, and we think that this mentor is part of the problem. So they did reach out to campus security, and they were limited what they could do because it wasn't on campus. The football team ended up going to this mentor's home and knocking on the door, demanding that they see her. The door was opened, and she was hiding in a closet and saying, yes, I choose to be here. This is where I want to be. And when asked, why are you hiding in a closet? She said, because I was afraid of you. Which, why would a young lady, I don't understand why she would feel that way, but obviously coercion, manipulation, isolation, all of these things, something was happening, right, to cause her to do this. Well, the story doesn't end there. I think mom got concerned. She did start taking it seriously because the roommates reached out to her again, and she did contact local police. And since this young lady, she was over the age of 18, she wasn't a minor anymore, the friends had no control. So mom did report, and the police officers actually gathered enough evidence. They went and I think they did more than just a wellness check at this guy's house. They raided it, and they found multiple young women there. Just days away, plane tickets had already been purchased, everything. So just days away from being shipped out into some kind of sex trafficking scheme. And it was so obvious to the people around watching that they said something's not right. Mm-hmm. But yet this young lady, again, I don't know all of the details or why she did what she did, but talking about those long and short-term effects afterwards, I mean, she had to be traumatized, number one, to be hanging out in a closet, hiding, but yet saying, no, I choose to be here. And then after being rescued, she was nonverbal for a few days as well. So it's just really scary. And it hits home, right? It hits close to home. Again, if it's not my child, it could be my child's roommate or a friend or someone. And the after effects are just so big.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's just terrifying whenever you hear news stories like that, and that they were so close to just being gone, and who knows where they would have ended up. Yeah, I'm glad they got there in time.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my friend's daughter, she was reaching out to, her mom saying, what do I do? How do I help in this situation? So I think it's important that we talk about what do we do? What are the first steps? How can we prevent? What are some suggestions that you have for us, not just to be aware and educated, but what we can do?
Yeah, I say I think they did a pretty good job. I mean, obviously she's out. She did not get shipped off to wherever they were planning on doing that. But definitely, as we mentioned earlier, hotlines are, if you ever see something, and you can just be a witness to it, but if you ever see something, please report that. But also, it's good to be aware of how it operates where you are locally, because it can look different in different regions and specifically overseas. But even in the States, I think different regions have different normalities with whatever they're used to seeing in that regard. So find out what's most common where you live. Something that even I was learning as I was trying to understand how it works more in where I was locally. I spoke with a lieutenant who was of the Special Victims Unit from where I was living at the time. And some of the things that he told me specifically about where I was living just really opened my eyes. Like he kind of explained where things usually happen. And I was like, oh, well, I eat at that restaurant every once in a while. And he found a girl just in a car alone behind that restaurant right by the interstate. And, just knowing, okay, that's about where things usually happen, around these hotels, around these restaurants. That's huge, because then you can naturally be a little bit more aware when you're in those locations. So just being aware of what it looks like locally for you, and learning about the organizations around you that are local, and seeing how you can support them. Oftentimes, because it is so sensitive with their trauma, they don't often allow volunteers to do face-to-face ministry or work with them. But you can support them financially. Oftentimes they'll have fundraisers and stuff. So there's definitely opportunities, but it might not be that face-to-face support. And be a voice to those around you, spreading accurate information, and not just being another voice to all of the chaos online, but being an accurate voice, and being well-researched and knowing what you're talking about. Before you go to post anything or before you share anything in a social setting, please be informed because it can save lives, as we have talked about a couple stories where that has happened.
Yeah.
People knew something was off and they did something about it, and that was phenomenal. That's how that should go down every time, but unfortunately it doesn't always. But continue to stay observant in public, and try to recall and just be aware of the things that you have learned, and just go from there. So
I think communities are trying to also raise some of that awareness. We're here in Indiana, and they have the Indy 500. And so when that was coming up, even when they have large events like at the convention center, but things like the Super Bowl, they talk a lot about Super Bowl. That kind of an event is a huge venue for, I guess, trafficking people for transportation and moving people. And they talked about that with the Indy 500 as well, because it's common to see a lot of people coming together. But sometimes I feel like that's a little bit of misinformation too, and like a scare tactic, right? Like, oh, I have to be really careful around these places, even though I think the intention is good to try to raise that awareness.
Yeah, I think it can go both ways, because I think some people interpret that as, oh, there's a big group of people, I'm going to get abducted.
Yes.
Whereas it's intended for, oh, there's a big group of people here, there's probably more going on behind the scenes than what I'm seeing. Because, for the Super Bowl, if you were traveling, you stayed in a hotel, something might be going on in that hotel that you're staying at. So to be aware of that.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be a scare tactic, but, to be aware and be observant of your surroundings, for sure.
Yeah, I think that we are getting better as a society at talking about these things, but I think giving more time and attention to it, especially like for our educators in the school system. Yeah. I've heard we had a guest speaker who spoke at a community event about sex trafficking, and she has a coalition that's set up in a larger city that neighbors ours. But she was talking a little bit about what that could look like in a classroom for teachers, even if someone has tokens, and it seems odd that they have tokens, or maybe they have some kind of a bracelet or marking that a person would be using to own them. It almost sounds like sex trafficking is like old school pimping and prostitution.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a whole other conversation. We might need a part 3.
It probably is, but she was talking about those things. The tokens were a form of payment, and so if you got so many tokens, you turn that in for whatever reward, or the bracelet was going to be a marking of who like owned them or was trafficking them. But I can't wrap my mind around what that really
something
looks like.
Something a little more. I guess easier to notice kind of in that realm could be like a marking, like of a tattoo of someone's initials. They do that sometimes, but it's not always in a place where you would be able to see that at school.
Sure.
Or in those kinds of
that makes more sense.
Communities. So yeah.
There's just so many more layers. I think we're probably just scraping the surface of it. And really, that's all this podcast is intended to do, to educate and give a starting position. What is that hotline that you mentioned?
So there's actually several hotlines that you can use. So if you Google a hotline, something will pop up, and that's fine. Any of them should be okay. But the one that I'm recommending is 888-373-7888. So call that, and they will instruct you on what next steps to take. So
that's helpful, even if we don't think that we need it, just to have something like that in our back pocket, because like you said, it may not be our immediate family, but it could be a friend of a friend that needs that help. Well, Rylee, thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of our series on sex trafficking. It's hard to have some of the conversations, especially if we would go deeper to look at more personal stories and what they've experienced. But understanding and knowing the basics of it really could save someone's life.
Absolutely.
Well, now that we know what to look for, changes in behavior, isolation, secrecy, control by others, or sudden gifts, even money, you now have the tools to step in with awareness and confidence. Remember, you don't need to have all the answers to take actions. You just need to act. If something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. Start a conversation, reach out, report concerns to the proper authorities or national hotlines. And most of all, keep being a steady, supportive presence in your teen's life. That connection is often the strongest form of prevention. Hey, thanks for listening. This podcast is brought to you by Clarity of Central Indiana. We hope you enjoyed today's topic. Be sure to leave us a review and share with your friends. You can find any links mentioned in the episode notes. Always remember that you have value, you have worth, you matter.